Welcome to Behind the Facts, a podcast that focuses on shining a light on the individuals that work behind the scenes, curbing the spread of false and misleading information, and fostering a culture of accuracy. I am your host, Thipe Maelane. Climate change is a global challenge, but its impacts are not felt equally. Africa contributes the least to the global greenhouse gas emissions, yet the continent is among the most vulnerable to rising temperatures, extreme weather, and food insecurity. How Africa is portrayed in climate discussions and what is left out of the story can shape policies, public perceptions, and ultimately the future of millions of people. Today's episode explores the role African fact-checking organizations play in driving awareness around climate issues. We'll dig into some of the most common climate myths circulating on the continent, examine how global narratives can overlook Africa's unique challenges, and discuss the importance of accurate, locally grounded climate reporting. Joining me for this conversation is Lanre Olagunju, Editor-in-Chief of CheckClimate Africa. Lanre and his team are at the forefront of providing accurate climate information and promoting climate awareness across the continent. Together, we'll explore how fact-checkers can help ensure that Africa's climate story is told truthfully and that misinformation doesn't distort the conversation. Welcome, Lanre. It's a pleasure to have you for today's discussion.
Thank you for having me, Thipe. I'm so excited to be here.
Getting right into the conversation, when we're looking at climate reporting and trying to understand what that is, what does it actually entail?
Very interesting question. What does climate reporting entails? Climate reporting, before now, has always been seen as an environmental issue, talking about issues around environment. But more importantly, I like to say that climate reporting has even gone beyond discussions or reporting or journalism on the environment. I think it has gone to a point where we now need to see how climate reporting is essential to social, economic, health, and even justice issues. I want to see how we talk about climate reporting and link it up with agriculture, with fashion, with lifestyle, with sports. So I give you a very clear example talking about sports. Recently, we realized that football matches have been affected by extreme weather conditions. And there are a lot of ideas and a lot of changes that are coming into place in terms of, okay, how can we ensure that climate change and sports, and then how are we able to adapt properly? So the point I'm trying to make is that climate change essentially reporting about the environment, but more importantly, it has to do with the link between the environment and every other phases of human life. And until when we begin to report on climate change with that strategy, with that dynamic, we are not going to be able to get maximum effect. Climate change plays a crucial role in shaping how we understand the risk, the policies, and also more importantly, the possible solutions. So when we put all of this together, we can now see that yes, we have a strategic approach to climate reporting, essentially as it concerns Africans. Because the truth is that the way climate reporting is done in other part of the world is different from how we Africans, are going to report it. So when we report it holistically, in terms of solution, in terms of policy, in terms of risk, in ways that people can easily understand, then we have a very good approach to climate reporting.
Thanks, Lanre, for painting that picture of what climate reporting is by bringing in those three pillars of risk, policies, and solutions. However, when we're looking at how Africa is portrayed in global climate narratives, what do you think, or in your experience, what gets overlooked?
Fantastic question. What gets overlooked, in my opinion, is the ability for us to explain the climate issues from the angle of Africans. And that's a very important perspective to this conversation. Most times, when it comes to Africa, much of the global reporting is filtered through Western lenses. And it's not so ideal because you can't solve the problems of Africans using, another approach or the way it affects other people in their own region. So most times we're talking about the crisis, vulnerability, doom, and it looks like a very catastrophic thing. Are we all going to all die because of the climate change issue? So I think that that's a challenge, but we have not come to a point where we African journalists are beginning to now speak about climate change in the ways that affect Africans, because many Africans still engage in farming, engage in mining. For instance, they say that many of the roles that are where extreme heat affects Africans is when it has to do with those people who work outdoor, the miners, the fishers, those who are in construction. So that might not be the ideal in the Western world. So the challenge, what is being overlooked, is that we are not reporting how climate change is affecting Africans in the way that affects them day to day, and that's a challenge. And until when we are able to articulate that challenge from the average African's perspective, we can't even talk about indigenous solution. We can't talk about African innovation. We can't even preach or even analyze issues around resilience. So that's a challenge. We need to report climate change, the way that affects the woman who sells fish in the markets, the fisherman, the farmer, the miners, the bricklayers, the engineers who are into construction rather. So once we are able to settle these imbalances, then we can now talk about solutions to the real challenge.
You bring in a frame that is very important for us to consider. Africa's always, or in most cases, painted as being vulnerable, or there'll be a huge disaster, or there'll be some sort of doom that will bring its end because of the climate change issue. We never actually look at the issue from a perspective of development, for example, of looking at how it affects health and the economy of individuals. And in this case, how do we communicate Africa's unique position, seeing that Africa is the least responsible for emissions, but the most affected by its consequences, and perhaps in some cases expected to have a bigger role to play in sort of dealing with the climate issue.
So like you rightly said, Thipe, Africa is contributing less than 4% to global greenhouse gas emission, but the challenge is that we are constantly being ranked among the regions most vulnerable. Are we vulnerable? Yes, we are actually vulnerable. Are we helpless? No, we are not helpless. And that's a very interesting narrative that I like to frame when I do, climate reporting, or I'm talking to other my journalists who are my colleagues. Yes, it's okay that some region have tagged us as vulnerable, but indeed we are really. But the most important thing is that we are not helpless. So we need to start with the facts, and that's where the foundation for fact-checking is being laid properly. Starting with the facts, reporting the issues the way they are, without exaggerations, we're not using fear. Because most times we think that when we use fear to frame our narrative, that we'll get more solution. But researchers have shown that fear preaches a lot of helplessness, and people just disconnect from the message and then from the solutions that they can also provide. So it's also very important to make it relatable. These are the things that can help us communicate the unique African position, aside from the fact that, yes, we contribute so much less, and then, yes, we have a lot of issues, but our people need to know better. They need to be able to relate to climate change, in a way that is not abstract, where we can talk about farmers facing field harvest, women walking longer distances for water, children missing school because of flooding. Talking about even education, that's a very angle that we don't really talk about most times. And there's a particular instance in Nigeria that I like to touch on, where feeding programs in school that should aid education, we should attract people in rural communities to come to school. Then sometimes many of those who are into the food production are now complaining or giving a report that the food gets sour easily because of how it is being stored before the children are being served, and then maybe that leads to maybe issues around food poisoning that could even affect the students when they eat the food. Talking about issues around extreme heat and pregnancy. There's a report, unfortunately the report was from the US, from the university in the US, talking about giving us figures about how extreme heat is affecting pregnancy and leading to many failed pregnancy and preterm delivery for women and things like that. So we need to highlight, issues around climate injustice, so that we can stress that those who contributed, we that were contributing least to the problem, are paying the highest price. When we can articulate this issue the way it is, and the average Nigerian, the average South African, the average Ghanaian is able to come to this clear understanding, not just because somebody has published some scientific jargons or details that are mixed with fear and doom. When people have this clarity, we can expect that our conversations and our demand from other regions of the world can now begin to speak to issues around justice. So that's how we can actually balance our vulnerability with resilience. Because indeed we are vulnerable, but sincerely, I don't like to paint a picture of helplessness.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the
This is
Facts.
Behind the Facts.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
Thanks for tuning in into Behind the Facts.
That actually it segues really nicely into the next question that I wanted to actually get into around what roles do organizations like yours play in countering narratives that shift the blame away from the most critical climate issues that affect Africa?
Yeah, so the approach is to make the reporting relatable and also let people know that aside from the myths, aside from the disinformation, aside from the false religious beliefs about climate change that people have, the role that CheckClimate Africa and other journalists in my shoes, the role that we play is to let people know that climate change is already affecting you, whether you agree to it or not. It's like the law of gravity, Whether you understand the physics of gravitational force or not, if you go to the height of a building and throw yourself down, you're just going to fall down. Whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a pagan, that doesn't matter. So what we're trying to do, the idea is that we're trying to let people know that climate change is affecting businesses, is affecting agriculture, which is in turn affecting the prices of goods and services. It's affecting sports. It's affecting architecture. I know. So when we're able to list out some of these key areas that speaks to people's day-to-day activities, the narrative comes alive. They see the role in which this issue, this social problem, is affecting their life. They begin to see the multiplier effect. That, okay, we have a problem already, problem of poverty, problem of insecurity. In fact, climate change and insecurity is an interesting topic entirely in a country like Nigeria. But truthfully, many Nigerians do not even see the link that the issues around herders and farmers is actually because many of the water bodies are drying up. For instance, a large part of the Lake Chad is gone already. And, sometimes you don't even know if we'll ever get back to what it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So when we're able to pinpoint some of these links together, people have a better understanding. They see the role that they are also able to play. So it now goes beyond doom. They are also able to make good decisions. They are also able to make tangible innovation and in terms of resilience and adaptation. So for instance, I spoke with a Nigerian professor at the University of Covenant University in Nigeria, Ogun State in Nigeria. And she was saying to me that architects are beginning to come with solutions on how our buildings should be in Nigeria so that we can give room for more ventilation. Simple as ensuring that our windows are constructed to a particular angle, to the angle where we can have good airflow. And some of these little things can solve the problem of extreme heat in cases whereby people are working from home and things like that. Because sometimes when we think about our solutions and we are thinking, okay, yes, we'll just get the air conditioners, but that it's another problem on its own because there's increase in the cost of power and in usage of electricity in terms of trying to use air conditioners to mitigate issues around extreme heat. But simple solutions that are very innovative and almost not expensive, like how we build our homes, how people should be told that they need to take more water on a daily basis. These are very, very simple things, but these are innovative ways in which would aid adaptation and conversations around resilience. So that's the role that we are playing. Let people see the problem. Don't use fear. Don't use doom casting. Let it be relatable. Once the narrative are relatable, people can get on the actions and solutions by themselves.
Indeed, like you said, climate change is affecting you whether you want it to or not. I think if anything is a takeaway from this conversation, that should be one of the biggest takeaways. I think it will motivate individuals who are listening in to, actually pay closer attention to some of the issues that you've indicated. For instance, the example that you highlighted of Lake Chad and linking it back to agriculture, food security, health. That is a very important water source for that part of Africa. And so when we're looking at the challenges around combating climate misinformation in Africa, in your work and in your line of work, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've come across when we're talking about climate misinformation?
I think some of the biggest challenges we have as religious beliefs. which are quite dangerous. People still feel in some part of Africa that when we have extreme rainfall or prolonged droughts, extreme heat, it's an act of God. And they believe that there's nothing you can do about it, which also increases the narrative on helplessness, which is not good enough. So people feel that no, it's an act of God. So leave it. And once it's an act of God, there's nothing you can do. But the science gives the fact that human activities, human actions is actually responsible for how our climate is at the moment. And however, there are things that we must do, in terms of mitigation, in terms of resilience, in terms of adaptation. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is also religious. People think that because of the sins of the people, we have become a very we don't serve God enough. Our sins are so numerous, and that's why God is punishing us with maybe wildfires in areas where they have wildfires, with extreme rainfall, with droughts and things like that. So these are limiting beliefs, and they have their background and their foundation in religion. On the other side, we also have issues around disinformation which comes from the fossil fuel industry. And the tactics that they use is issues around exaggerating the cost of renewable energy or even downplaying climate action generally. And all of these conversations which are happening in Europe are trickling down to Africa, essentially on YouTube, also on social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and the rest of them. On the third note, there's also an approach from government where governments use climate disinformation as a tool. So I give a very practical example. There was a particular claim going around Nigeria in 2024 when we recorded flooding and flash flood in many cities, in fact in about 30 cities, and Lagos was also affected. And the political class in Lagos came up with this narrative that, there's nothing we can do with respect to managing flood in Lagos, managing flash flood, because they were like, we can't even do much aside from clearing the drainages and all of that and showing that people don't build on drainage ways and things like that because Lagos is clearly below sea level. And that excuse that Lagos is below sea level, when they share it, they use it as an excuse to cover up for the failings of government in what they should have done in terms of infrastructural development to mitigate issues around flooding and other challenges around climate change. So I did a very extensive research. I spoke with professors. I did my research online, did interviews here and there, and came up with the conclusion that indeed Lagos is a lowland. However, the city of Lagos is not below sea level. When we make a long list of cities that are below sea level across the world, Lagos is not included. And I'm not sure that's going to change anytime soon. So, for instance, that's a tool that the political class use to make up for their own errors, for their own failings in terms of infrastructural development. So these are some of the narratives, and we have influencers who are also being paid, this is trying to butcher my second point, by some of these fossil fuel industry giants, pay them to share narrative on social media. A lot of funding is going into PR firms just to put questions to say that renewable energy is more expensive, it's not sustainable. And in most cases, they are not even speaking to the science. Or in some cases, they even say generally that no, climate change is false. There's no issue around climate change. What we do in that case is to just let people know that climate change is a real issue. In fact, it's a social problem that has a multiplier effect. And then we try to show people how it's affecting them already and tell them things that they can do. So these are some of the challenges around climate disinformation. And I think that is this surmountable? Yes. But this is the challenge the way it is.
I think you've highlighted quite three very significant things right there. And the first is around localized myths that are tied to traditional beliefs, what you call limiting beliefs that sometimes are linked to religious beliefs, that a higher power is punishing us for doing something or not doing something in a particular way. You've got the fossil fuel players, which are your big corporates that are downplaying the climate change issue, further exacerbating the understanding of the issue, which also makes it challenging for people to actually grasp what this actually is. And then you also got the political players in it who have their own agenda, using it as a scapegoat for non-delivery of basic services, for example. And in those examples that you gave, it just got me thinking to say, how do we get more people to engage with climate reporting? especially in the case of young Africans who will be the custodians of tomorrow?
So I think that we need to start with training. And the biggest challenge here is because climate journalism, climate change reporting has a major scientific component. So it becomes a bit tricky. Many are not so conversant with the science narrative, trying to explain issues around gases, the ozone layer, extreme heat, and some of those things can be quite scientific in nature, and then it results in a pullback by journalists. But I think that with training, by letting journalists know that you don't have to have all of the scientific explanations, you only have to understand it the way it is sincerely, without, like I like to say, without making people afraid, and then reporting it to them, framing the report in ways that people can relate with. That's the most important conversation in this case. So we need to train more journalists, train them and let them also compare storytelling strategies that has worked, so that we can translate complex scientific data into accessible, compelling stories. That is a way to speak to a persistent challenge like what we have. Also, I think we also need more platforms that are going to be focusing on issues around climate disinformation. We have a lot of platforms talking about the politics, the elections, foreign interference, and information manipulation, and a whole lot of other areas. But I think on the issue of climate, we need more individuals who are going to be able to speak, who are going to be able to report, who are going to be able to engage a lot of media and information literacy in that regard. So I think that with more training, I want to have a case whereby I have a lot of news desk who are also doing climate reporting. We don't even have them in every newsroom. And when we have, it's something that many editors come to maybe when there's a disaster, when there's flooding. And that's not supposed to be. Let us show them on a daily basis on how climate change relates to them. Let's reflect it in the news. Let's bring them out in the business reports. How is climate change affecting the stock market, for instance, if at all there's any link in that. So I think training is very important. Training people on reporting, training them on disinformation tools, training them on how to look out for very subtle disinformation in the media, on social media, by politicians, because climate change disinformation is actually very subtle. It's not always very loud, like when a politician is talking and he gives a particular figure and you can easily go and check that, no, this is not correct, this is false. In case of climate change, the approach is quite different. So people need to be trained on how to report them and how to also check out for the disinformation on social media platforms.
I want to find out from you whether there are any resources that you would recommend people could refer to when they are looking for credible climate information, especially in this information ecosystem where, with the overload of information that we have, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, you have just given me an opportunity to highlight what we do at CheckClimate Africa, because CheckClimate Africa is one go-to platform for many Africans to look around recent research, debunking of false information, and experts and scientific ideas, conversations around issues around climate change, essentially as it pertains to Africans. So CheckClimate Africa is that go-to platform, and I think that there should be more platforms like that. Okay, globally, I think that the UNFCCC is another good platform where people can actually go to get information, timely information. And UNFCCC is the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, and they have their platform on the internet. Benicard also has an online investigation focusing on climate reporting and then also climate issues around climate disinformation. So yes, I think we have some of them already, like I mentioned, but we need a lot more so that people can easily access conversations on climate change, essentially as it affects Africans.
We'd encourage everybody to please, go to resources such as Lanre's organization, as well as the United Nations resource that was shared by Lanre, just so that you can get a clearer understanding and a better grasp of how this climate issue affects us all. Because like Lanre has said, the climate issue affects you whether you want it to or whether you don't want it to. It is clear that the stories that we tell and the ones that we fail to tell shape how Africa faces the climate crisis. Fact checkers like you are helping to ensure the public debate is rooted in truth, and that's vital for building a more sustainable future. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today, Lanre. This truly was an insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Thipe. I'm so excited that we had this conversation. Thank you so much.
And for more conversations like these, remember to like, share, and subscribe. I have been your host, Thipe Maelane, and this is Behind the Facts.